Hi and welcome to this episode of ctl-alt-del-church, and with me today is Liz Crumlish. It's a delight to have you, Liz. You're on the cusp of something really, really exciting, so let's get that first. So what's happening to you this week?
That's right, Stewart. This weekend, on Sunday afternoon, I'm being ordained as a deacon in the Scottish Episcopal Church. Brilliant. So you can imagine I'm really quite hyper about that. Yeah. I've been a Church of Scotland minister for 25 years. The last 5 years I've not been in a parish, and that's led me into a process of discernment. Mm-hmm. And now it feels right to be ordained in the Scottish Episcopal Church. So that's a really exciting time for me. So
stepping out of the parish, I guess that wasn't something that you thought would happen when you kind of took up a different kind of role.
Absolutely not. In fact, what I wanted was to do the role I'm now doing from a parish basis. And I was devastated at leaving the parish. It really was the hardest move I've ever had to make. And honestly grieved for months and months. And then, in fact, it's only about maybe 18 months ago, I realised God nudging me. Because what happened was the first Sunday I wasn't in the parish, I went to the local Episcopal church, which was 2 minutes from our front door. And I thought I'll just kind of hide at the back here, recover. We moved to Prestwick, which has 4 Church of Scotlands. And I thought, I don't know where I'm going to go. I'll just sit here quietly for a while. But that's been the last 5 years.
Yeah, still sitting there, but not so quietly.
Not so quietly now.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. It's really exciting when something like that happens. That you kind of, I think there's always the kind of sense that sometimes you just kind of get into a rut, and you can't imagine. And it's one of the things we'll maybe talk about is you can't imagine things being different. And so for you to have this, kind of real kind of change and direction and call and a new opportunity is just brilliant.
Yeah, and. The main bulk of my work actually is encouraging people in discernment, not so much discernment to ministry, but discernment in ministry, what God's actually calling them to do. And I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that actually that hit me too.
Yeah, but sometimes we are, when it's your job, you kind of forget, don't you?
Yeah, do that for other people.
Yeah, do as I say, not as I do. So what is that other job then? What's the
title is Path of Renewal and Pioneer Coordinator for the Church of Scotland. So it's been 2 pilot projects. What I left the parish to do was to work in the renewal project, really just getting churches. It's really funny talking about this in the midst of pandemic, getting churches to stop what they're doing and to consult with God, basically. What is it you want uniquely for us in this community? And it was really, really difficult to get that stoppage. Mm-hmm. There's so many balls you keep on juggling, even while in the midst of discernment. So the pandemic certainly put a lot of that into focus.
Yeah, although at the same time, it's brought its own kind of relentless kind of pace as well, hasn't it? So for lots of ministers, it's just been, go. I kind of we reflected in the kind of first episodes of this, how difficult that was for people. Yeah. All of a sudden one day everything's online. You have to learn how to do that. That takes more or less time depending on what experience you've got. But it just, it's not an easy task. Every week
I have to say I have a real concern for lots of colleagues mm-hmm. who are just, I say consumed, and I'm not denigrating them in any way, but they have been consumed by that task. It's a real huge thing. Yeah.
So that this idea of stopping, so who stops and how do they stop?
What we were asking ministers to do was to make space for God. So find at least a couple of things during the week that they didn't need to be at anymore, or actually that didn't need to be done anymore. And that's like asking parish ministers to pull their own teeth. You know, it's been really an uphill struggle. However, once we got folk to at least think about it, they could come up with a couple of things that, you know, could lighten their load. And again, this was really countercultural. We asked them to read a bit more, to spend more time with God. And I'm not saying that ministers don't spend time with God, but that intentional focused time. And also to gather a small group in the congregation around them that would kind of make that discernment with them, so that they were not just doing the same old that parish had always done in that place, but they could imagine the future that God might be calling them into. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that it's like, you know, getting folk to pull their own teeth to get them to stop. And I you know, I can relate to that. I think that there's a kind of a culture of busyness in the church that has always been. You know, I think, you know, I had a kind of role, not dissimilar to yours, but, you know, working with children and young people for years and years and years, and trying to get people just to look. You need to stop and look around at least, and you know, recognise where you are. Never mind, you know, imagine something different, because we don't even do that. You know, we're not particularly reflective.
That's true. And I think that's where it was really important that I came out of a parish to do that, because I knew exactly that mindset. I also think it made the job easier in the beginning, because it wasn't, I know I used to object to people, head office, if you like, saying, well, you need to do this, you know. I felt I was able to say, look, I know what this is like, and if we're not busy, then we're not building the kingdom. But let me tell you. So what is that, poacher turned gamekeeper or something? Yeah,
but it also, you know, you're speaking out of a real experience. You know, you've, as you said, you know, you've been a minister for 25 years.
I certainly think that was really important in the early days of the project, to be taken seriously. Yeah. So, and that kind of helped to heal some of the grief I felt, you know, in leaving a parish, because I just loved that community.
Yeah. Yeah, and being able to bring all that experience to help other people is, you know, that's a real gift, to be able to do that. But at the same time, you know, it's a very different way of working, you know, as you said, than being in a parish every day with a community. Yeah. I can imagine why you missed that. I went the other way. I kind of started working, you know, with lots of people, and you know, moved towards a real need to be with one group of people all the time, and to you know, to be able to work through some of this stuff rather than talking about it all the time, you know, and see how that goes. So we're in this pandemic, which has changed things and not at the same time. Somebody said the other day that actually all it's done is magnified all the things that were already there. And I kind of like that. I think there's some truth in that. You know, so if we're already busy, we've just become more busy. If we're preoccupied with certain things, those are the things that have worried us the most. Or
things have been amplified.
Yeah. So how does that, you know, in the communities you've been working with, who you've encouraged to do this kind of stopping and reflecting, how's that changed across the last 8 months?
What it's shown is a real kind of polarity in the ministers and congregations I've been working with. Some have really embraced the time to reflect, which they have had. Others have just found themselves so caught up that any kind of space they had created has disappeared. You know, so I'm not finding anyone in the middle. I'm finding folk at both ends of the spectrum. For some churches, it's been really, you know, they've suddenly been noticed in their communities because they're doing food banks or clothes banks, you know, all that kind of stuff. They've suddenly become a real force in the community. So that's been positive. Yeah. And that's kind of led them to thinking, well, God, is this your purpose? And even if it's not a longer term purpose, it's God's purpose for now.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, I suppose churches are uniquely placed in their community to respond quickly to some of those kinds of issues, aren't they?
Yeah, they have the contacts. It's funny, I was having a conversation with a counsellor just the other day, and she was saying, you know, where she knows she would be helpful in situations, she's no right to be there, whereas the parish minister often has the right to be there and can then make the contacts. Yeah.
So one of the things that you speak about often is this idea of the kind of liminal space. Right. This kind of when the books are called things like How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, that kind of stuff, you know. So we're in this crisis, and everybody's in it, although to a greater or lesser extent, perhaps, and we're all reacting to it in different ways, and you know. So what is that? Is that a good space to be in terms of enabling people to change, or is it a difficult space, or can it be both at the same time? It
can be both, but for me, I've always been really optimistic about liminal spaces. I see them as places of creativity. If we allow them to be, they can be oppressive because we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. But if we just, I'm going to say relax into them, which is difficult when there's a pandemic on. But, you know, there is something about recognising this is where we are. What are we going to do with it? My first role in ministry was actually in hospital chaplaincy. And I thought that was a constantly liminal space, because you were meeting folk just for a brief interval in their life, and hopefully you were impacting. So whether it be impacting their bereavement so that the grief process was smoother for them, or whether it would be, you know, they'd just been given bad news and you were there to kind of hold them in that moment. It felt like always liminal spaces. And actually, I've been reflecting a lot on that work recently, because it was the hospital in Greenock I was in, and it's been kind of, you know, eroded recently. But there was a big maternity unit then, plus all the high dependency intensive care and everything. And I sometimes, you know, as I would walk into the building, I would think about what was going on in each floor, and how different it was. You know, how 1 minute I'd be sitting with someone at end of life, the next minute I'd be with young parents that had just experienced new life. And I feel that's where the church is at the moment. There's all these things happening in different floors, if you like. And it's about sitting with the experience we have, not necessarily with words of wisdom or with a plan for the future, but sitting in that moment, you know, sometimes with nothing to offer, but actually our presence, which is the really important thing.
Yeah, that can be a really rich and a kind of really invigorating experience, but it can also be really hard and draining, can't it? You know, that kind of
it absolutely can, and it's where we need to think more about our support structures and what's sustaining us. And that's one of the things that we absolutely hold any ministers involved in Path of Renewal accountable for. We insist that they draw up a rule of life, that whatever else is going on, that they are finding a way to connect with God in their everyday, you know, and so they've got that grounding. And we want them to build up other support round about them, but to know that they're keeping their connection with God and keeping those channels open.
I suppose it's the dog's barking again. It's one of those things, I suppose, like any, particularly as a minister, I think you are the professional religious person. Do you know what I mean? So you're responsible for providing religion and whatever kind of sense you make of that, or spirituality for other people. It's really easy to neglect your own in that, because it becomes a service provision kind of thing for folk. And I can imagine that's, you know, it's often one of the first things to go when people are busy, you know, that you forget your own nourishment.
It is. And I mean, and I know this in myself. It's the thing that gets hopefully not so much now that I've had more practice at it, but it used to be the thing that gets squeezed out most. Actually, that's one of the things that I'm been really fortunate in that's grown during pandemic. I had a friend spoke to me at the very beginning pandemic and said, "Look, could we do Compline once a week?" So that's where we started. And now, particularly through Advent, we're doing a morning office at 7 a.m, which I would never have envisaged myself doing. But particularly through Advent, we meet at 7 every morning, and then we still meet for Compline once a week. And the other week we were reflecting on all the different phases we'd been in and out of during the pandemic. Because I don't know if you know, I was furloughed at the beginning of it. And oh my goodness, that really threw me into I have to say, it threw me into a depression. I really couldn't figure out what it was all about. I was asking God, what are you trying to tell me here? You know, am I not doing the right thing? Is there no future for what I'm doing? Is there no future for me? Do you know, really? So having said that, you know, you then think there's folk all over the country have been furloughed. Who am I to be different? And hopefully the experience I've gained of that awful emotion will be useful at some point in the future. Who knows? But it's this, and that's going back to that busyness, isn't it? If we're not busy, we're not serving God.
But there's also something about, you know, we feel that we've been called in some way to do this stuff, and then somebody tells you that you can't. You know, and especially at a moment like that, I think, you know, the kinds of things that you do would seem to me to be particularly important at the moment. You know, if we're talking about, you know, how do we grow and develop and listen to what God's asking us to do and pioneer new ways of being, then, you know, you can think, well, you know, who would you want in a moment like this? Then, you know, and some of that, you know, some of that's just disappointing for everybody else as well as for you. That you know, and lots of denominations did that, you know, because
I was involved in a Fresh Expressions conference a couple of weeks ago, and all the denominations at that, the first people to be furloughed were the creatives, or what they called creatives. Do you know what I'm thinking? You know, and it shows you actually that many of our institutions are still operating on that business model. You know. We need to keep the things that will keep the lights on and keep the bills paid, and you know, it's and we, you know, I think churches across the country did exactly the same thing at a different level. You know, we kind of panicked about things like giving and, you know, that kind of stuff. The other fascinating thing about that conference was everyone, although this was full of people that are used to kind of coming up with new things and, you know, 5 ideas before breakfast every morning, they were all saying that what we really need now is more reflection time. They called it tomb time, sitting beside the empty tomb, waiting to see what was next, you know, but being there on the ground so that you were ready. And I found that fascinating, because I've actually been saying that a lot to folk. Look, please don't decide what's next. Don't, you know, and folk are saying, but we've been kind of locked down all this time. We need to get going now. So that was really interesting to see that folk that would normally be running ahead were wanting time to reflect and listen to what God was saying.
Aye, that kind of sense. I'd really like that idea, although it's not something that people would choose. Do you know what I mean? That I love that image, but you know, who would choose to go and sit next to the tomb? You know, because there's a in that moment, you know, particularly in that moment, kind of between Good Friday and Easter, there's only despair. You know, for the people sitting there, the idea that things could change and be a bazillion times better in just a couple of days was a really far off thought. You know, that they were just, but just to inhabit their grief is really important.
Yeah. I also wonder how much Advent helps with that, you know, because we're looking at preparing for a birth. So it's, you know, it's from the darkness of the womb rather than the tomb. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I was saying to somebody the other day that ordinary time seems to have lasted forever, and I'm really, really glad it's Advent. Just because, but it seems such a rich season this year because it talks about those issues of light and darkness, and you know, a kind of coming in anticipation of something that is a change, but it's a change in who we are and how we are.
Actually, that's really helpful because I didn't really feel I got to the resurrection this year. I just thought it was a rubbish time and I wasn't ready for it. Whereas I'm better anticipating the new birth. Yeah, I'm ready for incarnation.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that, you know, you can't rush that. You can't rush birth. It happens when it happens. You know, you know, there are some things that we can do now to speed that along a bit, but only when it's ready. You know, you know, it takes, and it's important. The gestation is really, really important.
Yeah.
You know, and we want to get to there. Of course you do. You know, because that's the good bit, kind of thing. You know, the birth, but the bit in the middle is really, really important.
I read a lovely thing this morning about. I've always thought about Meister Eckhart, who said everyone should be prepared to birth God, and it was talking about actually what birth involves, not so much the process of birth itself, but that gestation period and be giving yourself as an incubator, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's not a once in a moment, it's a total commitment. And then that took me on as a mother, that took me on to thinking about the you know, the then letting go, and that, you know, I mean, it tells us in the birth narratives about the sword that pierced Mary's heart, you know. Yeah, it's all there. Yeah.
And I think, I suppose what we get the opportunity to do at Advent, and maybe should be taking the opportunity to do much, much more, is to reflect on all of that, you know, to each year to come back to our own experience and to think about, well, how is this different this year? You know, what have I learned? And, you know, how has my experience changed, and how will this change me again going forward? And it's really important. It's really important.
And I suppose because we can't get out shopping, we can't do all the partying and stuff, it's a much more intense Advent, I think, that allows us to reflect. That allows us to sit in a liminal space.
Yeah. And that, you know, I can't remember who said it. It might have been Brueggemann. No, it was probably Henri Nouwen wrote about how we were terrible waiters. You know, that we live in a culture that's about doing all the time, and it's about, you know, waiting's an inconvenience to us. You know, it's a dead time. It's a time. You know, it's not even about, you know, there's no purpose in it. It's just the thing that you do before you do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
And he, you know, obviously kind of pulls at that and says, well, you know, actually it's a really rich time, the waiting, the anticipation, the you know, all that kind of stuff. And to allow ourselves to wait, and to allow other people to give them the gift of that waiting is I think an incredible thing, but not something that I had really thought an awful lot about until actually I went, you know, became a minister. Right. You know, because then you're helping other people to do that rather than, you know, thinking about yourself all the time. Because that's, you know, that's what happens.
Yeah, it's like we're content to say that it's not always a destination that matters, it's a journey. But part of that journey is the waiting beforehand, isn't it?
Yeah. So are there, you know, so this liminal leadership, what are the kinds of things that we need for that space? because it's not just we'll just sit and see what happens. There are other parts to that, aren't there?
Yeah. I suppose what I'm going to say might sound naff, but what we need is a lot of love, because for us to lead, we need to have someone that's going to take us on and follow us. You're not a leader until you've got a follower. So loving people enough to take them with you. Because the thing is, every change is perceived as loss. Whatever else, it's perceived as loss. And just empathising with people, yeah, okay, that is going to be different for you. I can see how you see that as loss. So taking that time to see other people's perspective and love them enough to sit with them while they get themselves to a different place. So I suppose that's what love and patience, and also a kind of willing incompetence, because we don't know how to do the next thing. We don't know what the next thing is. We don't know how to do it properly. So just being willing to embrace our own incompetence. And that, I think, is what excites other people, that kind of being willing to take a risk. Look, you can try this. If it doesn't work, we're not going to say to you, just don't do anything ever again. We're going to say, okay, so what can we learn from this? What can we try next? That kind of whole culture of trying, failing, learning, trying again. That's
been something that the church has been famously bad at over the years, hasn't it? That kind of reflective cycle of we tried that once.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it didn't quite go the way we thought, so we just never bothered to do it again, and we didn't ever think about why. And and so that leads, I think, sometimes to this kind of culture where we just replicate all the same. It's always the same. We just do the same things all the time, and then we do the same things every year, and it's because it's easy.
Yeah, we know what we're about, and it'll be safer to do something we're comfortable with. Yeah.
And the idea of failure scares the living daylights out of us.
Yeah. And yet, I suppose if we look at Jesus' ministry, I don't see the success in that. And we can look further down the line and think, yeah, there was churches built, but that wasn't, I don't think that was Jesus' plan. It's almost as though there wasn't a particular plan, in material terms. And yet 2,000 years later, here we are still celebrating Jesus' birth and what came of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of do an analysis. You kind of said, right, so he picked a bunch of people that weren't very good at being followers and didn't really ever understand them, got it wrong all the time, and he got executed. So,
what kind of plan's that?
It's the worst plan ever, isn't it? And we, I don't want to get executed. Thanks. That's not on my list of things to do today. So we settle for something that's a lot less risky, I think, and that for me is one of the real tensions in this life. That actually that whole thing is just a risky business. To boil it down to what I've just said is just nonsense, apart from anything else, because all of those people involved in that risked an enormous amount to go on this journey that they have no idea where it's going to go. And I'm not even sure, that for most of that, Jesus knows where it's going. Just that it's going to go somewhere, and to be okay with that. And just every day to think, right, well, where are we today? And let's do this, rather than worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day and the day after that.
And I wonder if one of the things that's happening in this season is that we can't think too far ahead. Yes, there's hope in the new vaccine and everything, but what we've also realised is folk need us to be Christ in their communities right now. They don't need us with clever strategies or any of that high-powered stuff. They just need us to be folk who they can trust, folk that will love them unconditionally. That, I mean, I'm sure loads of people will hear this and think, nah, you can keep that. I want to be out there doing, but I just think it's bringing us right back to basics of what it is we're called to be, or who it is we're called to be.
I was listening to a podcast the other night, and I actually was thinking about you when I was listening to it, and thinking, I must tell Liz, she'll love this. It was Brene Brown talking to Barack Obama about leadership, and it's just the most fascinating conversation. And she talks to him about this idea of being able to hold paradox, that both and can be true. The two things can be true at the same time, which can seem to be opposite. And the job of a leader is to stand in the middle of that, and for that to all be okay. But it's something that we find really, really hard. We're in this society that likes it to be one thing or the other, not both and. And she talked about there's a guy. It's the Stockdale paradox. It was a guy, he was a general, I think. He was captured during the Vietnam War and held as a prisoner of war, and he wrote about his experience. I think he became a senator later on, and one of the questions that people always asked him was, who did badly in that situation, who didn't do well? And he said the optimists didn't do well, because they always set short-term goals, so it'll be over by Christmas, and then it never was. It'll be over by January, and then that kind of cycle of dashed hope, which isn't really hope. It's this kind of false optimism kind of thing. It's just awful for people, and you can see it around you just now that people, it'll be finished. And one of the best things I think I heard in months yesterday was somebody saying, we've got a vaccine, but this isn't going to be over until late next year, and it's such a freeing thing.
Right.
Because, I don't need to live thinking, is it going to be next week? Is it going to be the week after? When's it going to get better?
Yeah.
I can forget about that now, and I can just concentrate on being here. And I wonder sometimes if one of the things that we do in the church is we think about that all the time, the kind of optimism, when's it going to get better? And we invest in all the wrong things to make it better. And one of the things that it seems to me about the work that you do is about taking all of that away and saying, right, well, we're here, and we're here now, and God's here with us, so let's do that first, and forget about the rest of it. The rest of it will either take care of itself or it won't, and that doesn't matter in some regards, because the only thing that matters is being here now with God, in the same way that for the disciples, the only thing that mattered was being with Jesus every day. All the rest of it was just stuff that would happen. Yeah. That's the most important thing. How do we encourage people to get back to that?
That's a huge question, isn't it? And I also think all the stuff that's going to be left to deal with, or maybe we're actually going to have to start dealing with some of it, the grief and the anxiety, the hopelessness, the poverty, those are things that have been amplified that we were talking about earlier. We can deal with all that just one bit at a time. Maybe that's what we're going to be called to for some time now. It may be not what we'd envisaged, but it's what we're in amongst. And it's also that whole knowing that God's already there, and waiting for us to catch up. So it might not be the most exciting place to be, but it is where God is, and it's where we're needed.
Yeah, and that's a very different thing from online church. That's a thing. Let's plough ourselves into all of that, and that is a thing, and it's important, and connecting with people in lots of different ways is important. But it feels as though I think you're right that for the next years, we're going to be helping people to deal with the last year and all the things that have happened because of it, and the different places that people find themselves in, and the grief that comes with that we're not even close to understanding, I don't think, yet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if the strategies that we had and the plans that we had are all ashes now, then there's a message in that somewhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not at all. You probably know me well enough to know that I don't subscribe to this being God causing this, but I do know that in the midst of it, God calls us to be different, mm-hmm. to continue to be different.
And do you think, for me, people have noticed that difference as we go along, and that's an attractive thing, I think, for people, so that people have come looking for something. I'm not sure they know what they're looking for, but folk have appeared, and
yeah. It's like the church suddenly has a use again, because we were so busy looking after our own, if I can say that, mm-hmm. and working out how we could build our kingdom rather than God's kingdom.
Yeah.
And it's just, for me, in the midst of everything else, there's something really rich in recognising that that's what we're called to, not all the other stuff.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things, which is deeply related, I think, to all of the stuff that we've been talking about, you write liturgy.
I do.
And it's brilliant. It's just great.
Oh, thank you.
You're the first person I look at every Sunday to think, what can I steal that Liz has written? That's a really creative process, to take an idea and to put words around it that would help people to engage with that idea perhaps differently from they've ever engaged with it before. So what is it about that really kind of grabs you? And
I think it started off as kind of my spiritual practice, that I would sit with a passage and the words come to me, that's mm-hmm. and then it became more of my way of processing out loud, mm-hmm. And then I just, in actual fact, the whole blog thing started because I was feeling really isolated in ministry. Mm-hmm. So I started to put a few things on a blog and people would interact, mm-hmm. and I would discover support. So there's that whole communicating, supporting, and I'm thinking if I'm, these things are in my head, why don't I put them out there if they're of use to someone else, good and well?
Yeah.
But it is my own processing with God kind of thing.
Well, there's a real vulnerability in that as well, though, isn't there? Like any kind of creative process, the sharing can be a kind of painful thing sometimes, because people might say stuff that you don't, well, that was rubbish, Liz, what on earth were you thinking? I don't agree with any of that. And on the whole, I think people are kind. They receive the gifts that we give mm-hmm. in a kind of creative endeavour. Folk think, thank you for sharing those things with us. But it is a vulnerable process, isn't it?
And what I've really enjoyed is putting together an Advent set of reflections this year. I mean, I do it most years, but this year it felt important in particular to somehow find that light in the darkness and to ground it in the reality. And again, it's what we've been talking about, isn't it? Here is where we are. What are we going to do with it? What's God asking of us in it? We've been sharing Jonathan's videos of your reflections each day. So Jonathan's at Largs. He's been making kind of wee videos using your reflections each evening. Yeah, you didn't know that.
Well, so he has, and we've been sharing them. So your fame precedes you, and that's not the only place that they've popped up. I've noticed around.
I noticed. Paul did actually say to me in Law Parish. I've been on at night and listen, and it's lovely. I mean, I know this is a bit about ego, but it's lovely to hear someone else speaking words that you've penned. Do you know that? It's just, and it actually speaks to you again.
So that's okay, because I always wonder, we have a young woman in our congregation who's a poet, and occasionally she'll send me some stuff and I'll use it on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And she always says it's a really, powerful thing to hear your words spoken back to you, because I'll read it in a way that's probably different from how she might have phrased it, or the emphasis that she might give it. Or is that what you find?
Yeah, I think that's creative too, because then you're hearing it in a different way from how you spoke it, and that can inflame something else, which is really, really helpful. Do
you think it one of the things that I suppose is great about the church and its kind of widest sense at the moment in Scotland is it seems to be rediscovering a lot of these kind of creative processes that got lost for a while. We're creative every week in that you write a sermon, which is a creative task. But this kind of the poetic side of church, I think I have a feeling that people are starting to really re-engage with some of that in a way that we haven't probably for hundreds of years.
Right. I hope this doesn't sound too far-fetched or building myself up, but I think there's a real close connection between the poet and the prophet. Mm-hmm. And we stopped listening to the prophetic voice a long time ago, so maybe that's a more gentle way into getting in touch again with that prophetic voice.
Yeah, it's one of the things we have morning prayers twice a week, and we look at the Old Testament on a Tuesday and the New Testament passage for the week on a Thursday. And it always strikes me, particularly like just now, but we're in Isaiah because it's Advent, how much of it is poetry. And you can tell by the way that it's printed on the page. It's not justified paragraphs. It's a poem, and we forget that. This book is just full of poems and songs, and that I think one of the things in the forgetting is that we forget to read it like that. That we read everything as if it's the same, and to be presented with a song is not the same as being presented with a letter or a biography or a history. Yeah. And I suppose what's maybe behind that kind of re-engagement in poetry is a comfort in the. I suppose it's back to that kind of liminality, that being okay in the kind of not having a right or a wrong answer to that poetry just opens up an idea.
It does. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a way of processing what's about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose, we have an object, and depending on what way you look at it, it provides different things for us, doesn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And coming back to the vulnerability, I just think the creation is really, really vulnerable. Unless we are prepared to put ourselves in the midst of that vulnerability, then we can't relate to people properly unless we're willing to be vulnerable.
Is that the kind of being part of creation? I wonder sometimes if we think we stand apart from that. That it's one of the kind of the issues of humanity, in some senses, that we think we're somehow separate from all of it.
Yeah, I heard John Bell one time making a distinction between us being created to dominate creation, or us being created to care for creation. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's a very different place to inhabit, isn't it? Yeah, we seem to err vastly to one end of that than the other. So what's next for you? So you're going on retreat?
I am. I'm having a retreat before ordination. Do you know? I'm really. I feel as though I just exist in liminal space, but I really don't know what's next. At the moment, I feel the calling to still do this full-time role in the Church of Scotland and be non-stipendiary in the Episcopal Church. Who knows where that's going to go, though? I mean, I do feel that the gifts I have can be well used in the Episcopal Church, and there's no reason to stop doing what I'm doing. But I feel like a real sense of it's okay to be where I am right now. I'm still encouraging people enough in the Church of Scotland. I have gifts to bring into the Episcopal Church, as well as loads to learn. Don't get me wrong. I'm loving the idea of being a deacon for a while, and not least to learn all the kind of the words and the magic that's all different.
Yeah, and there's lots to learn.
I just think it's such an exciting place to be just now, because I know that there's a role I have to do, and there's a role that's unfolding, and here we are. We'll see what happens.
I can't let you go without commenting on your sweatshirt. So you've got your sweatshirt says, "Nonetheless, you persisted," and I have a kind of sense that could be branded on you somewhere. Never mind on your sweatshirt. But one of the things that I love about it is she persisted, and one of the things that you have been a kind of very strong voice for is the place of women in ministry. That's been a really important thing for you to nurture and to support other women in ministry.
Yeah, in fact, I do another spiritual practice throughout Lent. I do a reflection, and I started off this year doing reflections on women in the Bible, and it kind of get cut short by the pandemic because I just felt there was so much else to reflect on, and I'd really love to get back to that. There is so much leadership, women's leadership in the Bible that's unexplored, so yeah, I do think it's a good place to be, and I I've got the choices I've made both in the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Episcopal Church come on the shoulders of women of generations before me, and what I have noticed is that sometimes you get shut out. I want to be a woman whose shoulders I'm happy for folk to stand on rather than closing ranks. I want a bigger table, not a closed down thing. Yeah.
Brilliant. Liz, I wish you all the best in the week to come, particularly, and every blessing in your retreat and your ordination, and I can't wait to see what happens next.
Thanks so much, and thanks for your encouragement.